So our next speaker is Vicky Xiao from the Pascal Bernatchez laboratory. Vicky could not be with us today. So we have Pascal Bernatchez from the Pascal Bernatchez laboratory. Pascal is a professor in the Department of Anesthesiology, Pharmacology, and Therapeutics at UBC. His laboratory is based at the Center for Health Lung Innovation at St. Paul's Hospital, and they'll be speaking to us about endothelial reprogramming. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I am not Vicky. This is Vicky. She's an amazing undergraduate student in the lab, but she apologizes. She actually has a final today. And she's been working with Chris right here, who has been also an incredibly productive graduate student in the lab. So for those of you who don't know what we do in the lab, what my lab mostly studies is endothelial function. We are endothelial biologists, we're endothelial pharmacologists, and we're fascinated by endothelial function, and you'll see why a bit later, because there's a couple of reasons for that. First, when using the term endothelial function, I'm referring to the three main soluble mediators of endothelial function: nitric oxide, prostacyclin or PGI2, and the endothelium-derived hyperpolarizing factor or ADHF. And one of the reasons as to why we study endothelial function in the lab is because it's associated with aerobic exercise, which is well known to be like cardiovascular disease protective. And also it's associated with laminar flow. For some reason, when you shear endothelial cells for a while, they start releasing more NO, and this tends to be, again, associated with anti-atherosclerotic properties, for instance. So as a whole, endothelial function is associated with vascular homeostasis. But the real reason why we study endothelial function in the lab is because so many medications mimic or potentiate endothelial function coming from the endothelium. So for instance, if you've heard of Viagra, you've heard of nitric oxide, because Viagra works downstream of NO. Also nitroglycerin, it's one of those complex NO donors. And PGI2 is basically a Flolan, which is used for pulmonary hypertension. These are wonder medications, and it's been like this for a while. It's a known fact. But then if endothelial function is so protective and associated with wonder drugs, how come we don't have drugs that directly stimulate the endothelium, like an endogenous way to increase endothelial function? This is one of the conundrums in the lab that we just don't get. So we have multiple tracks to tackle this big question mark we have. How come we don't have drugs that target the endothelium? And one of the tracks that we have to tackle this is our work on ARBs, or angiotensin receptor blockers. So ARBs are one of the most common blood pressure medications, like they're number 3 way up there with diuretics and ACE inhibitors. So they're typically referred to as sartans, because all their last names like ends with, these drugs end with terminology sartans. They typically work on the kidney to lower blood pressure, but they're well known to be pleiotropic. They do other things. As a whole, they tend to punch way above their weight. They do other things we don't understand. They're often used in non-hypertensive settings in the clinic, usually off-label, and they have elusive anti-fibrosis effects that some people believe are through inhibition of TGF-beta signaling. It's something that we don't really understand. But something that really interests us in the lab is when we started noticing that those ARBs have a massive effect on endothelial function. So we did quite a bit of aortic contractility studies over the years. Let me walk you through this graph here. So you basically have in black the phenylephrine dose response curve. Oops. So basically this is contractility, more contractility at the top, and then the more phenylephrine you add, the more contractility you have. Well, if you treat these animals for up to a year with those ARBs, especially telmisartan, the champ, you basically lower contractility to levels that, quite frankly, I've never seen in 20 years of working on nitric oxide. And the other thing that's interesting is that if you block NO with a broad NO synthase inhibitor, LNAME, This is mostly gone. So we know we're looking at nitric oxide signaling with ARBs. So 80% inhibition of contractility, reversibility with nitric oxide synthase blockade. Depending on how you do it, you basically have 90%, an effect that's 90% NO dependent with a bit of prostacyclin and a little bit of VDHF. But one thing that's fascinating also is that complete absence of tolerance up to a year. We treat our animals we've treated them for 14 or 16 months. It always works, but usually NO you have to be careful because you tend to build tolerance. That's something that we just don't understand. And in fact, if you compare to aerobic exercise, you just exercise your mice, this is far, far more effective than anything we've seen when it comes to aerobic exercise. So is this why those ARBs tend to punch above their weight? Is it why they're so good? And when Vicky started in the lab, what we wanted to know is what is the source of NO? We wanted to know the source because if you want to design drugs or optimize NO signaling, well, we kind of have to know the source, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with the nitric oxide system, there are three NOS isoforms. There's inducible or inflammatory NOS, iNOS. It tends to be associated with inflammation. Lots of NO being released by iNOS. Neuronal NOS tends to be more linked to neurotransmission and synaptic plasticity. We know it's there in the vasculature. We don't really understand it. Hopefully, we're not looking at NO because I have no expertise when it comes to nNOS. And finally, one of the two primary suspects with iNOS was basically endothelial NOS. It tends to be mostly protective, although it might play a role sometimes in inflammation. And I wanted to know whether it was, for instance, eNOS or iNOS, because this is one of these like landmark papers that everyone in my lab knows. It's a paper from Paul Koobs a while back. He basically showed that if you block eNOS activity with L-name, leukocytes start rolling pretty quickly on the endothelium. So we know that NO has a Teflon property that, again, we don't really understand. And basically, so we wanted to know, is it eNOS? Then that would suggest that we might have like an anti-inflammatory effect, for instance. So Vicky, what she basically did is that she treated with ARBs wild-type mice as a control and the three NOS knockouts. So basically iNOS knockout mice, nNOS knockout mice, and eNOS knockout mice, based on the simple pharmacological principle that if the target of the drug is not there, the drug should be inactive. Kind of makes sense, right? So she treated those mice with telmisartan. It was a shorter 3-week treatment, just in the interest of time. You can see here wild-type, iNOS knockouts, nNOS knockouts, and eNOS knockout vessels. Which knockout does not respond to telmisartan treatment? eNOS knockouts. So whether it basically suggested that eNOS, which tends to be protective and anti-inflammatory most of the time, is the main source of those, the ARB-induced nitric oxide release or increase in endothelial functions. And this is really interesting. You'll see why a little later. But when Vicky started getting those data, we have another program on ARBs, also a big shout out for CIHR for funding these studies. But basically we have a program on aortopathies, especially aneurysms, which is basically the widening of the aorta, and after a while it basically bursts. We have a fibrillin 1 deficient of aneurysm. So if you look at the aortic root, this is the heart here of a mouse. You can see here aortic widening compared to wild-type controls. The aortic root gets bigger and bigger. But if you do, you use our model of aneurysm on a background of an eNOS knockout, you form those gigantic aneurysms, gigantic. And what's really important to us pharmacologists is that while ARBs are known to be very efficient at blocking aortic widening in those mice, if you use an eNOS knockout background, those ARBs no longer work, which suggests that eNOS is not only the source of ARB-induced endothelial function or NO release, but it's also therapeutic. This is probably why those ARBs are so good. So all this data combined, what we're basically suggesting is that there's this thing we call the therapeutic endothelial function reserve. We're suggesting that those mice, and hopefully humans, are just using about 20–25% of our endothelial function. It's there, it's dormant. But all the downstream signaling of NO, prostacyclin is there, which is why you can mimic the endothelium with those drugs because downstream signaling is there. So basically all we need is to increase the activity of the endothelium, and then hopefully we can have a more endogenous way to promote vascular health. For some reason, there's absence of tolerance, again, something we don't understand. And now we're looking at the contribution of the endothelial AT1 receptor versus the possibility of having another receptor using flux allele mice. This is a little bit complex. And basically what we're interested in now is everything I showed you is in the subendothelial space. What happens on the luminal space? NO is highly diffusible. As I told you earlier, it's like a Teflon against inflammatory cells. So now we're finally starting ARB treatment of mice and using the air pouch assay to characterize leukocyte adhesion in our mice. We're also interested in anti-thrombotic effects of ARBs. Also biomarkers. Is this true in humans? Measuring endothelial function in humans is tricky. Having good biomarkers would make our life a lot easier, so that's something we're interested in. And again, as a whole, it supports the concept of repurposing ARBs in non-hypertensive settings because, as I told you earlier, they're pleiotropic. They do other things. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions. It's very clear.
How much of the NO that's in the system, how much is it endogenously produced by the endothelium?
Well, we don't use exogenous NO, so we're assuming that it's 100% endogenous.
Because in the in vivo situation, platelets are also a source of that. So.
That's a good point. When we do myography, we isolate the aortic rings. So we basically get rid of any blood elements. So everything seems to titer pretty well with the vessel itself. So whether there's other cells sticking, everything's possible. But at the moment, we're pretty certain. Oh, and if we remove the endothelium, everything is gone. So we know it's endothelium-derived nitric oxide. Thank you.
So my interest in NO relates to Hemasol, where most of us lost our pension plan. Basically, my understanding is red cells can actually scavenge and deliver nitric oxide.
Remotely, yes, this is fascinating.
Right. Did you have an interest in that or not?
Yes, I'm interested in this because NO is typically associated with large conduit vessels, like the aorta. When it comes to resistance arteries, NO tends to go down a little bit, the importance of NO. And when it comes to microcirculation, it goes back up a little bit, but not as much as I would like to think. So basically the possibility that NO can be in the aorta, jump on the red blood cells, and be delivered downstream, I love that. How we can test it, we need, again, more flux allele experiments, but that's a great concept that would work really well. Thank you.